Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to a virtual teach-in on why we stand with Palestine. My name is Michelle Higgins, and I'm the Executive Director of Faith for Justice. I'm also proud to be the senior pastor at St. John's Church, the beloved community in St. Louis, Missouri. We hope that wherever you are joining us from, you are ready to have a conversation about the importance of standing with Palestine. We hope that you're ready to converse with people who might be in different places and that you know and feel as Malcolm X, our great shining prince whose birthday we remembered and celebrated just a few days ago, as Malcolm X said, to not rush to judge people who don't look like you, think like you, don't get there as fast as you, but to remember that your story involves growth as well. I'm joined by an incredible panel of teachers, guides, witnesses that you will hear from tonight. We are excited to welcome Terrence Hawkins, Mira Stern, Aaron Rodgers, and Andrew Gibson, who will speak to you in that order in just a little bit. What brings us here tonight? What is the lay of the land? What is the ground that we're standing on? Many of us know that since the inception of the United States of America, the colonial settler model, this settler colonialism has been so entrenched and deep in our history that it's hard to separate our own ideas, even from the theology that follows governments in our land. We are so overwhelmed and overcome with forgetfulness, or for some of us, an adjustment. And we have found that in many places, it is our faith spaces, the spaces where resistance should be so quick, the spaces where advocacy should come as early as it does in the alphabet. It tends to come last because of adjustment to the way things are. The way things are in the United States is this, that 80% of people who claim to believe that person that is at the center of my faith, Jesus Christ, 80% of the people who believe that Jesus Christ is alive and kicking in heaven happen to be the majority of people who put Donald Trump in the White House. It just so happens that 75% of those same people support the state of Israel and all that that state does, no matter how dangerous, no matter how harmful those things are. We are here tonight for a slightly different reason. We are here tonight because 48% of Black Protestants, that is Black people who are people of faith, they're non-Catholic, they're either mainline or attend evangelical churches, 48% of our own family believe that the state of Israel should be supported and protected by a government like the United States that has dedicated over $3 billion of our 2021 budget alone. By a country like the United States where over $1 billion in charitable donations has gone to support the Friends of Israeli Defense, militarism at the heart of our faith. Massacre at the heart of our faith, at the heart of the faith of a people for whom resistance has been our song, the heart of a faith of a people for whom adjustment to crime has been something we refuse to do. So I want to welcome you. I want to call you in to a place where you're going to hear stories of love and support. You're going to hear stories of conversion, of coming out, of waking up, and you are going to hopefully engage. Bring your whole self without worry or fear that judgment sits in front of you. We are inviting you to ask the question and hear the answer, why we stand with Palestine. We're grateful for our hosts tonight, the Deaconess Foundation, specifically the Deaconess Center for Child Wellbeing that sits in the heart of St. Louis, intentionally seeking to find ways for our children to thrive. And we believe in thriving no matter your age. And we are very, very proud that the Deaconess Foundation is able to host us tonight. So beginning with my brother Terrence, moving on to Mira, then you'll hear from Aaron, then Andrew, and together we'll have a conversation about why more and more Christians are looking at this global struggle for freedom as it hits closer and closer to the human condition. So we were made for liberation. Terrence.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Terrence Hawkins. It's such an honor to be here to engage in this very important and timely discussion. I'm from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and I help lead a collective of faith-rooted activists called the Drum Majors Alliance. And again, want to give a special shout out to my sister, the Reverend Michelle Higgins, for the invite. She asked me to talk a little bit about the Black struggle and the global struggle. So in the next, hopefully 8 minutes or so, I want to briefly narrate and sketch out what's been called the Black radical tradition of struggle, and to connect its past and present to the global struggle for justice and peace and the abolition of all systems of domination. I begin with the fundamental assumption that Black people are a holy people, a beautiful people, a regal people, a sacred people, an image of God bearing people. Wherever we may dwell on the face of the earth, whatever languages we may speak, whatever cultures and customs we may embody, we are again a holy, beautiful, regal, sacred, and image of God bearing people. And regardless of the ways in which we've been scattered across the face of the earth, we are a connected people. We are fruit from the soil and vine of Mother Africa. We are Africans, y'all, period. I say all that to make it clear that we're more than struggle. We're more than the sum total of our trauma. We're more than the worst things that white supremacy has done to us. We exist beyond the oppression, even as we undergo the oppression. All this to say that our lives matter, our lives are sacred again, and that we must always claim that sense of personhood and self beyond what empire has said about us. Selfishly, I want to point to the genesis of the Black radical tradition from my own city, from my own natal home place, place called Winston-Salem, as I just said. And I begin the story with a story that I believe is emblematic of the African response to white colonial aggression and oppression from our very first encounters with it. I begin with a Mandingo warrior who is recorded in our local history books as being called Sambo or Samba. Samba was captured by white colonizers in his West African homeland and forced to endure the treacherous horrors of the Middle Passage. He initially was sold in Virginia, but eventually he was purchased by a peculiar religious group called the Moravians. The Moravians purchased him, and this Mandingo warrior refused to relinquish his freedom spirit. He refused to let go of his sense of self. He refused to accommodate himself to the system of chattel slavery. And as a result, he made not one, not two, but 3 attempts to escape bondage. Tragically, after each attempt, he was captured, brought to the Moravian settlement, and brutally tortured. Some years later, when he was a much older man, he converted to the Moravian faith, and he assumed the name Abraham. Now, I'm going to be honest, y'all, that has always troubled me because I grew up hearing the story about the Mandingo warrior Kunta Kinte in Alex Haley's Roots, and how he refused to take on his oppressor's name or his oppressor's idolatrous religion, right? But here's this man who converts, gets baptized, and assumes the name Abraham. And one day I was just having a little talk with Jesus about that because I was still feeling some kind of way about it. And I just believe I had this unction that made me think perhaps Abraham or Sambo, assumed the name Abraham symbolically to basically position himself as the father of many who would come after him with that very same freedom spirit. And so that's why I've begun to call Abraham the father of Black radicalism in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I believe that describes his life and story, describes what the Black radical tradition and struggle is all about. It's this refusal to accept the world as it is. It's this desire for freedom that doesn't just stay in one's heart, but is enacted with one's body, with one's practices. And so Abraham represents this tradition in my own city, and you see this tradition at work from the moment we were on slave ships, fighting against colonizers to get free, from the moment we engaged in slave rebellions on plantations, the Underground Railroad, the massive organization that we did to seek our own freedom. It's been alive and well. It was alive and well in the days of Reconstruction, where W.E.B. Du Bois says that the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again toward slavery. It was alive and well in the struggle to abolish Jim and Jane Crow. It was alive and well in the Black Power era, and it remains alive and well in this moment of the movement for Black lives. And it says to us that we live in the afterlife of chattel slavery, and we've inherited systems of punishment and captivity, not systems of care and mutuality. And that our ancestors' wildest dream was not to be included in the settler colonial system, but it was to overcome it. It was to dismantle those systems. And at its core, this tradition of struggle is both anti-racist and anti-capitalist. Because as Ruth Wilson Gilmore put it, capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. It's anti-imperialist and anti-colonial because imperialism is the highest form of capitalist domination. And colonialism, as Frantz Fanon put it, is the conquest of a land and its people, and we refuse to be someone else's conquests. It's therefore internationalist, not isolationist. Because as Fannie Lou Hamer put it so plainly, nobody's free till everybody's free. I'm gonna say that again. Nobody's free till everybody's free. And that is a global statement. Martin Luther King put it this way: we're caught in a web of we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Or as Ella Baker put it once when she was giving a speech in Puerto Rico, she said, I am not free here in America, and you are not free here as so long as there's capitalism and imperialism. So this tradition, as John Coltrane would put it, is a love supreme. It's a riff off of those words in John's gospel. For God so loved the world, not just your hood, not just your barrio, not just your res, not just your trailer park, not just your nation state, but the entire world. And this beautiful tradition teaches us that the forces of oppression in our world are borderless. They ain't got no borders, y'all. They're not worried about our little border lines. They cross the borders. They're global. And this tradition teaches us to resist the immaturity of oppression poker. Come on, somebody. Y'all know we be playing it sometimes. I'm gonna trump my offer with my Nakba. My offer is the great disaster of the Black Holocaust, and Nakba is the catastrophe of what happened to our Palestinian kinfolk. But it resists that. And it comes to see that we are tied together and that our freedom and flourishing are bound up with each other. So I'll close with this thought. As practitioners of this Black radical tradition, we must carry forward the legacy of solidarity with Palestinian people unapologetically. We who have been victims of settler colonialism and apartheid know very well that our struggles are linked. The very same forces that constructed and upheld chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and Jane Crow in the US have been at work in the land of Palestine. Our respective contemporary movements face police forces that have been trained and coached by each other in racial profiling and violent suppression of protests through what are called police exchanges. Our struggles are intertwined and bound together. Therefore, we all unapologetically, in the name of the God who is love, call for an end to settler colonialism. We call for the freedom of all people everywhere, of Palestinians, of Colombians, of people in the Congo, of people in your own hood in Winston-Salem. Let freedom ring everywhere. And I'll close with this line from the Black radical poet June Jordan. She said, "I was born a Black woman, and now I am become a Palestinian. Against the relentless laughter of evil, there is less and less living room. And where are my loved ones? It is time to make our way home," end quote. To be at home in the love of God is to place ourselves at odds with empire, which is anti everything that the love of God stands for. God bless.
Woo. Y'all free yet? Y'all free yet? Woo! Terrence, thank you, my brother. If we weren't grounded before, we're grounded now. We are so grateful for this word, and grateful even more to feel a link, a connection now between what is more than our struggle, an identity deeper than, older than, bigger than our struggle, an identity that transcends our struggle and also joins us with all who wish to be free. We're joined next by Mira, who is an Instagram influencer. I don't know if you even like to be called that. It's too bad. It's too bad, sis. That's what you want, girl. We are very, very thankful that Mira Stern is with us, based in the Bay Area. We are very thankful for your time and to have among us a Christian organization, to be joined by one of our kindred in the Jewish faith. And she's going to share with us some lay of the land and give us background on Zionism. Mira.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I don't feel like I can say anything of importance after that preaching, Terrence. I mean, I did not come prepared like you. We're done. We can go home. We can go home. That was gospel for the entire week. Thank you. That was beautiful. And yes, I mean, I appreciate your words. I appreciate your grounding. I appreciate the heart and conviction and like the inextricable, united love that was behind your words, because I feel like that's the calling that brings me into this work. And that is what has gotten me free. That is part of my process of my personal liberation journey, and our collective liberation is deeply understanding our inextricable ties to one another, and knowing that, as you said, oppression and domination and terror knows no borders and knows no confines. And really seeing the links and the strategic locks behind all of these forces that we are trying to tear down is what has been so part of such an integral portion of my journey. So I'm gonna do my best to share a little bit, and then definitely open, to more questions in our Q&A session. But and I want to begin by naming. I feel like most white folks who are on their journey, and I think all of us who are non-Black folks, I think our liberation and our grounding and our wisdom of what it means to become free comes from Black people, and particularly Black women. And that, as the folks who have been the players and the pushers in my journey, and just hearing Terrence's wisdom right now reminded me a lot of that. And in my own undoing Zionism journey, that is really who propelled my work, right, into becoming wholer and committed to global liberation. So I'm going to share a little bit about my personal journey, and then talk briefly about kind of this beast that is Zionism, that really needs its own, like, college seminar. I'm not going to do it justice, but as Michelle said, I'm based here in the Bay Area. I'm a third generation San Franciscan on Ramaytush Ohlone land. I currently live in East Oakland on Chochenyo Ohlone land. My family is all Ashkenazi Jews from Poland and Lithuania, Romania, Hungary, Ukraine, many from places that don't exist anymore, or towns that you cannot find on a map. I've been doing a lot of ancestral work recently and trying to locate the exact places where my ancestors migrated from. And similar to many colonized people and folks who have been either stolen or removed from their homelands, there is a deep loss in not being able to locate, where our families were for many, many, many generations. And for me, that's a big component of this work of divesting from Zionism and reinvesting in my Ashkenazi-ness, my Eastern European roots. So I grew up in the small shtetl of San Francisco. And even though it's in the middle of a super mixed city, or what was a very mixed city in the 80s and 90s, like you'd think that the only people I knew were white Jews, primarily white Jews. And so that was my community. I went to Jewish preschool, Jewish K through 8th. Every family member I have is Jewish, like Jewish summer camp, synagogue, this, that, and that. My grandfather was a rabbi at the synagogue that I grew up going to. He's the only grandparent I never met, but I feel the most connected to him. So, my family has deep Jewish roots, both in the Bay Area and then globally, right? And this idea of Israel, this perpetual image of Israel and our allegiance to it and connection to it, was just hyper present and never questioned growing up. And I think this is like so multi-layered, and something that is really, again, like a grief-filled process for me. And I think for many other Jews who are going through like a breakup process with realizing something we were so tied to is so devastating, similar to when us white folks begin our journey of divesting from whiteness and realizing how we have been tied to something that is only rooted in terror and domination. And that beginning of like breaking up, which also includes many family ties and friendship ties and community ties breaking. Israel was just like a constant thing, right? It was the home for the Jews, the global home for the Jews. And the words Palestine were probably uttered maybe twice during my whole upbringing. Literally never taught about, just erased, and I think about, and this is in a very like liberal social justice, Bay Area based Jewish community where there's lots of queer folks and, lots of like other layers of diversity and forward thinking. But I've been thinking a lot about, in other Jewish communities, especially ones who are incredibly conservative, there's a lot of vilification of Palestinians and of Muslim people. And I've been thinking about what's worse, right? What is worse, to completely vilify and criminalize a people, or to erase them and to act as if they don't exist? And it's, of course, not a binary, not a question we can answer. But I have so much grief that in lines with settler colonialism here on these native lands and the erasure of native people from San Francisco, Oakland, the lands that I grew up on, so goes this erasure with Palestinian people for the majority of white American Jews. And again, Israel is this thing that's just inextricably tied from your relationship. So growing up at our K through 8 private Jewish school, Monday mornings we'd have assemblies where everyone stands up and does the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag. And then right after, you do the Pledge of Allegiance to the Israeli flag and sing the Israeli national anthem. in pretty much every synagogue around the country, you'll have an American flag at the front and an Israeli flag. You have Israel Day at summer camp. You have Israel Day at, at school. Israel, again, is just a fixture. And it's taught as, this is your home. This is your land. You can go here whenever you'd like. So when I was 16, I went on my first trip to Palestine, what some call Israel, but I refer to as Palestine. It is Palestinian land. And I fell in love. It was amazing. It was probably one of the best months of my entire life. And this traditionally in the middle class and upper middle class Jewish community in the United States, kids go as this confirmation trip when you're like 15 or 16, kind of like your rites of passage into adult Judaism and things of the sort. And so this tie to Israel, again, became even more solidified as I built bonds there. And I'm a fiery, loudmouth Sagittarius. A lot of people in the United States cannot handle me, right? Sag over here also? Okay, great. And so growing up, I was often told, like, a lot of white people here can't handle you, but go to Israel, like you're really hyphy, like they can handle you there, right? So I felt a lot of connection. I felt like finally a space where I could be free and extra and open was met. And it was an incredible opportunity to, see Judaism in such a different sense, where growing up as someone who is a minority in the United States, numerically, right? I don't like the word minority, but if we think about in terms of how we're represented, right? There's an incredibly small number of Jews in this country and globally. And so going to a place where Jewish folks were the majority felt very different. It was a visceral experience of belonging and connection in my body. I went again when I was 18 on another very Zionist trip. Freshman year, my dorm room hung an Israeli flag. I felt incredibly connected to, again, this country that in my mind was a Jewish place. I started to read Zionist propaganda that folks in my community passed around. And again, mind you, this is all coupled with, me being outspoken around racism and homelessness and classism here in the United States. I remember reiterating this line that you often hear in Zionist circles, where this perpetuation of Jewish trauma and Jewish fear is just completely recycled. And that's, again, a huge component of what it means to be a Jew, I think, in this day and age. And also the identity of Israel is so embedded in trauma and in this idea of scarcity and annihilation and fear, and we are constantly under attack. So I remember stooping so low to say something like, this was again repeated to me, if Israel, if the Palestinians put down their weapons tomorrow, there would be peace. If Israel put down their weapons tomorrow, there would be no Israel. And I have compassion for my younger self. I try to have compassion for folks who are still in line with those values. And I know, and I simultaneously hold a lot of rage and anger and grief that our existence, our humanity can be pitted against people who are our literal siblings and cousins, and who are from the same lineages, if we go far back enough on our family trees. And not even like 200,000 years back, right? Like 1,500, 2,000, that's pretty recent in human history, right? And when I transferred to UC Santa Cruz, when I was a junior in college, my world started to kind of bust open in the sense of understanding, white supremacy and colonialism and capitalism. And again, this was Black women and brown women and queer folks and all sorts of other marginalized people who pushed my thinking forward and propelled this kind of liberal social justice Bay Area mindset into understanding systems of oppression and understanding systems of domination. And I still tried to have Palestine and Israel as the exceptions, like many of us in the Jewish community do. We want to be down for civil rights. We want to be down for all the other movements that we've been a huge part of here in this country. And consistently, deny our analysis of this other land. And so as my analysis pushed forward, I opened myself up to thinking about the harms and the perspectives that Palestinian people were consistently begging the rest of the world to listen to over and over and over again, being denied, being shut down. And my heart began to bust open in ways of connection and compassion, and in ways, again, of deep grief and mourning for the detachment from a place that I once felt a lot of love and safety and connection to, and also a lot of rage of being indoctrinated very intentionally from an incredibly young age, like most of us are, right? Most of our families and our communities collude in oppression of somebody else without our consent, right? And I look at children, I'm a former educator, I look at young folks consistently who are spiritually and emotionally way ahead of us as adults, right? And consistently more open to freedom, consistently more open to what it means to see one another's humanity and connect with everyone, and center the folks who are struggling and suffering. And I have a lot of rage and a lot of sadness that young people are consistently bought into something that is filled with terror. And I think there are, of course, so many layers of the ways that Jews are held as responsible for Israel, which is both, I think there's reality to that, and that there's also a lot of layers of anti-Semitism in that. Whereas we don't ask a lot of other groups to be responsible for the complications in their country, not complications, but the terror and oppression in their countries, or the countries that might represent them or their ethnicity. And so in divesting from Zionism, divesting from this idea that Israel is the home of the Jews, right? And needs to be a homeland for Jewish people globally at whatever cost. There's a lot of misterminology that goes around, right? There's a lot of pitting. We hear language of, the Arabs versus the Jews, or Palestinians versus Jews, right? And we often think of Jewish people as white people, but Jewish people are Arab, Jewish people are Black, Jewish people are Asian, Jewish people are from all over the world. And historically, of course, y'all are followers of Jesus, right? The first Jews are Arab people, right? People from the Palestinian region in the Levant. And so this erasure of the fact that Muslim and Christian and Jewish people lived side by side in peace and harmony for centuries and centuries and centuries in those lands really reminds me that, again, Zionism is rooted in a white supremacist project. It is rooted in a European colonial project, whereas, of course, there are so many atrocities that Jewish people globally have experienced. And creating a state for our safety on the backs of other people will never make us safe, will never make us free, ever, right? And so I've been learning a lot about Christian Zionism and the ways in which that actually is even more pervasive in this country than Jewish Zionism. If we look at the numbers and we look at who has lobbying power and philanthropy power, which again is mind-blowing to me because my bubble growing up was like, oh, this is a Jewish project, right? And realizing again, as we see time and time and time again since whiteness was invented, that anyone who is not part of the white Christian elite is used as a pawn for their larger goals and their larger visions, whether that is Black people, Indigenous people, Jewish people, right? There is actually no one who is safe under this system. And so the goal of Christian folks wanting Israel currently to be under the ownership, leadership of Jewish people, so that they can then come and convert us, or we will die if we don't accept Jesus, right? During the coming, the second coming, or excuse my terminology, I'm not a Christian, I don't know these things, but need to ask my partner for the proper terminology. is again rooted in this idea of none of us matter and none of us are safe unless we are white Christians who also are wealthy, likely are straight, likely are men, and are dominating at the top of this global system. So I'll end there. I could go on forever and ever and ever, but again, just looking at our interconnectedness, thinking about the ways in which this indoctrination happens for all of us, depending on our people's particular needs, is something that is incredibly necessary for if we are actually committed to this idea of global liberation.
Wow, such a powerful witness, Mira. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mira and Terrence. I mean, they really said everything. I mean, what can you add here in the space? Again, everybody, I'm Aaron Rodgers, Director of Mission and Theology for Faith for Justice, part of the Troublemakers at Trinity Episcopal Church. Before I begin my reflections, I just want to, take a moment for sacred silence for all the lives lost for the freedom fighters in Palestine, for those struggling for freedom all over the world. So, Pastor Michelle wanted me to reflect on this question about, did the Black church resistance to oppression somehow miss supporting Palestine? And before I offer my comments, I have to say this. I'm part of that Black radical tradition that Terrence eloquently described. I was raised in the Black church, honed in by the hymns, baptized in the blues. I got Sunday candy from my grandmother and a fiery sermon from my pastor. I love the Black church. So all of these comments come out of love and a deep appreciation for what I believe the tradition actually speaks to. And when I think about this question, if the Black church resistance to oppression somehow missed supporting Palestine, if I'm completely honest, I just have to say a good portion of us have. A good portion of us have. And it's mostly because the Black church, which I like to call the Freedom Church, the Black church, the Freedom Church, in all honesty, ain't completely free. As Angela Davis told us, freedom is a constant struggle. And in the process of liberating ourselves, we have sometimes and oftentimes ingested the pollution of the problem we have tried to resist. This pollution has and continues to prevent us from seeing the hand of the oppressor when it changes zip codes or continents. It makes us blind to other people's suffering. It has prevented and separated a number of Black pastors, Black churches, Black clergy from actually seeing the other existential Black bodies on the other side of the world. The pollution was already named. It's white supremacy, white colonial imagination, and the theologies that they produce. Those things have been operating in this country for a long time, and they continue to make us sick even as we resist them. There's a story. I know Mira's not a part of the Christian family, but let me tell one of my favorite stories from my tradition. So there's a story in the Gospels, right? Jesus encounters this human who was oppressed with many demons. He gets asked what his name. He says, "My name is Legion, because we are many." And the whole flip of that story is that at the end of that story, the demons are named, they're called out, they're told to go into pigs, and then the pigs are sent into the water, right, to drown. In America, that story is enacted over and over again, but the ending has a different result, right? In America, what has happened is after we have named the demons, after we have called them out into the pigs, instead of sending them to drown, we ate them. We fried them up, we glazed them sometimes. While we have survived what we have been given, here's the main point. While we have survived what we have been given, we have oftentimes not moved far from that malnourishment. We oftentimes appropriate the very thing that was meant to kill us. And the white supremacist imagination, the white colonial imagination, has really created a series of sick theology, a series of malnourished theology that we continue to perpetuate, even though it continues to make us sick, even though it continues to harm not only our Black bodies, but Black bodies around the world. So I wanted to just name a couple of these in my reflection as I see them. The first is this theology of chosenness. This theology of chosenness, Turian Webb talks about this in his work, Troubling Idols. When you are oppressed, when you're no one's child, when you have no land, when you are divorced from your people, from your cultural context, from your own indigenous and sacred imagination, what happens often is that we rationalize captivity and oppression with the hermeneutic that doesn't necessarily heal the pain, but triages it. There's a theology of chosenness that runs throughout the sacred text that we all hold dear, that tells us, or that tells the people that the story is based around, that they are chosen for this specific course, that they are chosen for this existence, that they are chosen for these things that happen to them, that they are in the midst of overwhelming circumstances, exile, displacement, that they are still chosen by God. And there's a maneuvering around how can we keep this idea that we are chosen by God in the midst of this circumstance. And I have to tell you that as a person coming from the experience of the Black church, that resonates with me, right? We are too a people who have been divorced from land, displaced, oppressed, exiled. But the thing is that in the Bible, of course, the chosen theology that you find there was never meant to be lorded over others. In fact, there's a pretty healthy evidence that the witness of those scriptures is that your witness was to be the key to not only your own liberation, but to the liberation of others, right? The suffering servant in Isaiah, he grew up before him like a tender green shoot, like a root out of dry ground, no beauty, no majesty to attract us to him. Nothing is appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by humankind, a man of suffering, familiar with pain, or acquainted with the bitterest grief, some translations say. The suffering servant wasn't a celebrity. The suffering servant wasn't somebody in power, wasn't somebody with weapons, militarized weapons, wasn't somebody that could enact this sort of painful influence over others. Ultimately, Jesus Christ becomes the full representation of this suffering servant, and Jesus in body, in life, lived in opposition to a state imposed on people, in opposition to a state that occupied and terrorized poor people of color. White Western coercion of scripture leads us to a chosen theology that supports oppression, that comes up with bastardized children like manifest destiny, that tells us that what it means to be chosen is to lord and to rule over other folk. And that is just not what freedom tells us is the right witness to have. Mira talked a lot about Christian Zionist indoctrination, so I won't go into that. But I just got to say it very plainly. Black church pastors, we got to stop taking free and discounted trips to Israel to be propagandized against people who suffer. We have to stop listening to voices that have been served to us and instead listen to voices and perspectives of people on the ground. People on the edges of power, people on the edges of American influence and money. Stop it. Stop doing it. The other child, and let me wrap up because you get pastors talking, they never end. The other theological child from whiteness, from white supremacy, from colonialism, is this theology of scarcity, where somehow in our churches, we have come to think that there's not enough freedom to go around, that there's not enough liberation to go around, that somehow to champion the causes of someone you don't know or have never met, that somehow that dilutes the potency of your own freedom. We have to reject that thinking. We have to stop thinking that there's not going to be enough freedom for me and a Palestinian. Either the whole world is in the hands of God or nobody is. We have to counteract these theologies of bastardized chosenness, of Christian Zionist indoctrination, of scarcity, and understand, as Terrence talked about earlier, that the real solution to those things is a reciprocal solidarity, where we understand that God is talking about all of us, that God wants all of us to be free, or none of us can be free. We have to take down the barriers, take down the walls, take down the nationalist lines that separate us, and realize that we're really fighting the same devil on a different continent. And every single time white supremacy, white colonialism shows up, it tries to divide us. It tries to separate us. The witness of the Black church is ultimately this. And this is what I got from the stories that I learned about the founding of the Black church when we were in the hush harbors, when we found community together, when they told us that we couldn't go to church and we made church happen anyhow, is that whatever white supremacy put in us, the only thing that will take white supremacy out is our collective power and our resources in uniting our stories together. Collective power is the only resource we have for taking white supremacy out. We can't do that isolated. We can't do that playing oppression Olympics or oppression poker, as Terrence like to say. We can only do that by making a table that is open for everyone. And so, remember, listen to the stories. God's got the whole world in his hands or nobody.
Well, Mira said Terrence said it all. Aaron said Mira and Terrence said it all. I really don't know why I'm here. But we'll see. Maybe y'all can tell me at the end. So again, I'm Andrew Gibson, Director of Partnerships with Faith for Justice. And I want to start with the Audre Lorde quote, when she said, "I know that my people cannot possibly profit from the oppression of any other group which seeks the right to peaceful existence." So I grew up in a church in St. Louis that was multicultural before that was a hashtag that I was aware of, and before it was something that most churches were putting in their mission statements. I actually don't remember hearing the word as a kid, multicultural. I don't remember hearing the word Zionism either, except when I started listening to hip hop. But going back to the church, one of the three pastors was a Jewish Christian. Many of the church members were Jewish Christians too. And that was a part of the culture of our church was Judaism. The idea of a Judeo-Christian faith was not difficult for me at all. We lit the menorah, we celebrated Hanukkah, the kids learned how to blow the shofar. I was on the worship team, we played Jewish songs. They were sung in Hebrew. There was a Hebrew language class on Sunday mornings. If you showed up to church and you want to learn Hebrew, you could pull up and learn how to speak Hebrew. So one of the pros of this is that I never remember thinking of Jesus as a white man. I definitely never remember thinking of him as American. I never thought of him as a white man. I always thought of him as a brown-skinned man who practiced religious rituals that were different than some of the religious rituals that I practiced. And so therefore it was kind of a good thing that we were doing some of this Jewish stuff because it made me feel more connected to the person of Jesus, the God man, who God chose to be, right? God didn't choose to be anybody else, chose to be Jesus. So the idea of Judeo-Christian faith was very, very easy for me. But the con of this is that I kind of bought into the very never directly said, but very subversively taught ideal that the state of Israel now is the same as the Jewish people, and that's right where Jesus would be kicking it all the time. And that taking a stance on Israel wasn't political at all, because we weren't a political church, right? White evangelical churches, no, we stay out of politics. All of them except one, right? And two at my church, and one was saying that everything the state of Israel did was righteous. That was, what God would have us do. And while I don't remember any direct anti-Palestinian words ever being spoken, it was just this constant allegiance to the state of Israel that said to me, I should not only never question anything that the state of Israel does, but I should defend it whenever possible. I should donate to it whenever possible. And then go figure, in the hallway at our church was not only an American flag, but also a flag of Israel. So the verses that were said a lot, constantly, especially in prayers at the church, were when Romans, where it says first to the Jew and then to the Greek. And again, maybe a pro of that is that as a white person, it did teach me to kind of take a back seat to ethnic minorities, or maybe anybody that I perceived as an ethnic minority, which really helped on an intentional anti-racism discipline later on. But again, the flip side of that coin was that it taught nationalism to me, even if not specifically or primarily American nationalism, but just nationalism in general. And in this case, to the state of Israel. So teaching us that the state of Israel was the same as the Jewish people was something that I didn't really question until later on. And this, to me, looking back, is very similar, if not exactly the same, as American nationalism, where we take America and we make it synonymous with Jesus, which that's not true. And we know that's not true. And part of America's story is that we didn't want British rule. So we're like, not that, but this. The irony is real, but it's really not complex. So early in my adult life, as I started on an intentional anti-racism discipline, I very quickly asked, how in the world could Christians support oppression of and dispossession of any people? Whether that's people in the city of St. Louis, where I'm seeing the church do it, or if it's overseas with Israel doing it in Palestine. So even as my church did it simply through prayer. Every Sunday morning prayer was praying for peace in Israel, peace for Israel. Every Sunday. It was a very common, it was like the Lord's Prayer in my church. So I just started to question that. Why are we supporting the state of Israel oppressing Palestinian people and going into this land saying, this is our land, we're supposed to be here. You all that are already here, you need to go. So pretty confusing to me in adulthood, especially as I thought Jesus was Palestinian. little research led me to find that the state of Israel actually wanted to dispute that and say, no, Jesus was Jewish and therefore no nationality. That didn't make any sense to me at all. So the threads were quickly coming undone, and praise God for that. So God, I was taught also as a Christian that God created all people free and equal, but then quickly saw that the idea of supremacy amongst those supposedly free and equal people, and none more than white supremacy, said, actually, God, no, you didn't. We deserve this land more. I want that land. I want that title. I want that money. I want that status. And by God, I'm going to get it. So a couple quotes to close us out. James Baldwin said, it's easy to proclaim all souls equal in the sight of God, but it is hard to make men equal on earth in the sight of men. And Toni Morrison told her students, but I think all of us, that our real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. And if you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else.
Wow. I want to take a moment and just breathe. 4 incredible stories, prophecies, sermons, prose, and poetry have been given to us. Let's take just a minute and gather ourselves. We want to ask our panelists to stick around. The teaching is not over, friends. We still want to hear from our friends who've gathered, but let's take a quick break, just 60 seconds. Go grab another glass of water. You may have to, run to the restroom a little bit, but please come back and join us in just 1 minute. And I have some questions about the current oppression in Israel, Palestine today, and talking about land and talking pretty earnestly about what support really looks like. So we'll take a quick break, just 1 minute, and we'll be right back. Thanks so much, everyone, for sticking around. We want to ask our panelists in terms of talking about Zionism, Christian Zionism, understanding and knowing that none of us are free until all of us are free, but also offering sources for how we got to this particular oppression. We want to acknowledge that Faith for Justice does operate through and teach and learn from a queer Black feminist politic. We also are fully aware that people, including our own faith family, we know who folks talk to, and we know what is weathering. And so our Palestinian kindred that folks might say, well, why aren't they here tonight? I think it's a fair question. We know that it's weathering to deal with some of these questions, to be confronted with things that might seem simple and straightforward for people that are not suffering a particular oppression right now. And we want to do our part as people in the Judeo-Christian faith. You've heard the testimony and the witnesses of our panelists, and we want you to know that we are not without intention of who we have brought together tonight, and it is fully in support of solidarity to show that the rest, the peace, and yes, even the absence from some of these kitchen table conversations, the absence of our kindred who are suffering most right now is intentional. So I want to first acknowledge Aaron, Terrence, y'all as my fellow Black preachers in the room. How do we begin to really not contend, but maybe connect with the demands of the BDS movement in Palestine, boycott, divestment, and sanctions? Many of us have read through, we've seen the arguments for and against the BDS movement, but at the core, their demands are these: to end the occupation, to bring equality for people that are Jewish and non-Jewish, and to grant right of return for Palestinian refugees. If we take these demands as they are, how do we move towards this discussion of boycott, divestment, and sanctions for our faith families that we worship with every week? I'd love for both of you to answer that.
Go ahead, Brother Terrence.
Let's go in alphabetical order. I'll jump and I'll go. Yeah, great question. I think in terms of our communities of faith, we have to create spaces like this one where folks can dialogue, be exposed to information that they're generally not exposed to, say the dumb or ignorant thing, but have a response that's, research-based, love-rooted, compassionate, but a real challenge and a real push and a real calling higher. So I think that what we're doing right now is super important in terms of being in solidarity with the BDS movement. And I think connected to that, we have to recover the best of our own tradition. There's a poet that said, love is remembering the song in someone's heart and singing it to them when they've forgotten it. And I think a lot of times, and there are forces at work beyond us that are very powerful that try to make us forget. But nevertheless, we get to a place of forgetfulness. But I'm just thinking about, the call for boycotts and divestment and sanctions. And I'm thinking about Martin Luther King's very last speech, the mountaintop speech, where he unequivocally says, we got to boycott some of these oppressive capitalist, colonial corporate enterprises and redistribute the pain. Say what, Martin? That ain't the Santa Claus Martin. That ain't the Mr. Rodgers Martin that's just going across the country begging white folk to be his neighbor. That ain't the fat Black preacher trying to, fit down the chimney of white America. That's a revolutionary prophet saying, no, love calls us to actions that are bold. And in many ways, the boycott, the sanction, the divestment is almost like a refining fire for the powers to say, look, y'all need to come up off of what you're doing and open up space for people made in the image of God, just like you, to not only survive, not just a ceasefire. You got to cease the apartheid. You got to cease the sanctions on them, the starvation. That stuff has to go so that we can truly claim our collective humanity. So I don't know if I answered the question well, but that's what spilled out.
No, that's right on. That's right on. That's right on. In agreement that we have to cultivate spaces like this, but what I would add is that we have to take a deep look at ourselves, right? We have to wake up to how we are assisting in oppression. Just with divestment in prisons, there are tons of churches that are invested in campaigns, banks, pension funds, universities that all support like the state of Israel and Israeli international companies that help, sustain the aggression, that help sustain the apartheid. And we really have to take a deep look at what we have in place that is already supporting that stuff. I would say before we begin to, call out others for change. Look at yourself first, clean your house before you go over to somebody else's. But definitely, so once our house is clean, I think we need to move over across the street and start seeing what power can we use to leverage to stop this, decades of, aggression and occupation. Boycotts are certainly one, right? Putting pressure on our local governments and our government officials to do sanctions or to stop supporting, that's definitely another. But one of the things that I was struck by was how even in the Ferguson uprisings, there were stories of how Palestinian sisters and brothers would reach out to protesters in Ferguson to teach them, like how to treat tear gas, right? And all this other stuff like that. And so I think there's tons of ways that we can show solidarity with what we have, with the resources that we have. How can your local congregation, how can your local group, support the protesters? How can you support Palestinian families? What can you do to, make the connection? What can you do to amplify the stories that they're being told? All things that you can do within your own kind of arena and power base. So I think it's a dual thing that we have to work collectively. We have to leverage the power that we have, but we also have to, take ownership, our own responsibility for participating in that oppression and what we can do to resist.
That's right. Wow, thank y'all so much. Mira, in addition to, if you want to add anything on that previous question, please do. I also would love to hear just more of your interactions with Zionism and Christian Zionism, especially as we've discussed how the end result is anti-Semitic, right? It's truly at its end a conversion therapy. The idea behind Christian Zionism as saying, and yet the thing that we're calling beautiful and supporting, we're actually lying to you, it's not enough. How have you experienced, encountered not just those pieces, but how would you as a Jewish kindred encourage people who, or challenge people who don't know that they're trapped in Christian Zionism to see that anti-Semitic end? And then also, what are your, if you want to respond to that conversation of the BDS movement, how would you move towards and see that, even especially as one of our Jewish kindreds, in ways that strike really at the heart of something that you were raised to love?
All right, I'm taking a breath because I'm trying to mentally catalog all of those questions. Okay, I'm going to start with Christian Zionism. Again, I think this is how Christian hegemony works in this country and in this world, is that it's one of the silent, one of the silent oppressions, one of the silent kind of ways of being, similar to, I mean, many forms of oppression and domination, of course, move coercively and strategically, but I think particularly with Christian hegemony, it's not something that we name enough, if at all. And I started to learn about it maybe about 10 years ago, and it's definitely not my forte in terms of the ways in which I kind of navigate and am able to analyze the world around me. But I know that Christianity is, of course, embedded in white supremacy, and white supremacy is upheld from a Christian perspective. And so I would say, of course, not all Christian folks are white supremacists, right? But even in the histories of how Christianity, of course, unfolded in this country is rooted in enslavement and rooted in domination and colonization. And I think there's, of course, that's not my lane to reckon with, right? But I think that's an important thing to name, is that, again, white Christianity ultimately at the end of the day wants to hoard and collect power for their own and just their own. And so when we think about Israel, as I mentioned earlier, I think Jews are held responsible for Israel. And there's an assumption oftentimes that Jews are Zionists, that all Jews support Israel, or that, again, it's Jews' responsibility to disrupt Zionism and disrupt what Israel is doing and has been doing as a ethnically cleansing, genocidal empire, which on one hand I think is very true. I like my lane is white Jewish people. That's my community. That's who I feel the most influence over. That's who I feel the most responsibility for. And so when I call people out, whether that's online or in my family, there's often pushback of like, you're assuming that, you know, Jewish folks have this responsibility, or you're conflating Jews with Israel, and that's part of the problem. And I think for a lot of people, it's a cop-out, and it's an opportunity to not take responsibility for violence that is done in our name. And I think there's also an incredible like nuance there, right? Of you know, we don't ask every Chinese person we know to be held responsible for the occupation of Tibet, or for the ethnic cleansing of Uyghur people in Western China, right? That's not an assumption we have in terms of associating other like ethnicities with the problems of their government or the problems of their homelands. And not saying that Israel is my homeland, but I mean like the place that represents us, right? Or that has stood to represent us. So I think that's where anti-Semitism, I was just talking about this earlier with a friend, of like, that's where anti-Semitism comes in, I think, when we hold particularly Jewish folks responsible for this issue. And on one hand, yes, I think Jewish folks are responsible because this is like this violence is done in our name. The violence is not done in the name of Christian Zionists, who again are like the puppeteers up here that nobody sees, right? On the ground, my friends and loved ones in Palestine on the ground, they're not seeing Christian folks coming in and occupying their lands. That's not who's guarding the checkpoints. That's not who is stealing them from their homes in the middle of the night. That is not who is harassing them in prisons. That is not who is barring them from movement back to their homes, who has like literally occupying the homes that their grandparents and great parents lived in, that they were removed from, right? So that violence on the ground, they see and is represented and is done primarily by Jewish people. So I think it's just incredibly nuanced. And to be completely honest, I feel like anti-Semitism is something that I'm even beginning to learn more about. It's something that I'm not even well versed in as a Jew, right? Ironically, I've experienced it. I've here, of course, understand the different layers in which Jews are blamed or thought of as like, the Rothschild, whatever, running everything at the top of the Illuminati conspiracies, things like that. But in terms of navigating the nuances of it, it's something that's new for me. And so I feel like I'm totally veering in the opposite direction of your questions, but I can't even remember exactly how it was phrased. But I think in this case, there's an incredible opportunity for Christian folks, and again, particularly the white Christian evangelicals and folks who are behind the lobbying and the dollars that we see going towards Israel in this country, to begin undoing their own anti-Semitism, and to spend that learning time understanding how anti-Semitism is a function in this country, is often a function of white supremacy. and the ways in which all of that uphold, again, a layer of domination. But I have little faith in white Christian people, and I don't know if that's controversial to say or like problematic to say, right? I see a lot of nodding. I mean, we look at the legacies of this country and this institution. There's nothing holistic or beautiful or holy that white Christian folks have done. And so I think there's an opportunity for every other, right? Every other in this place to really band together. And of course, that work has happened and has been happening for centuries. As long as people have been colonized and captured on this land, that resistance work has been happening. But there, particularly with, the Jewish community, which in the United States is about 90% white folks, and the Black community, we have been hand in hand in struggle for so many years, right? For so many years. And I think that gap divided a lot after the civil rights movement. And now is an opportunity to come together both around Zionism and around white supremacy in this country and around wealth distribution and all sorts of things. So I think we obviously have a lot of learning work to do, and that's my forte. I'm an educator, and I think, within the white Jewish community, we uphold anti-Blackness in myriad ways. We uphold capitalism in myriad ways, and that's our unlearning work to do. And also, again, looking at our internalized anti-Semitism. And perhaps in other communities, there's like anti-Semitism is, again, one of these oppressions that is often dismissed. It's disregarded, it's minimized. It's like something we don't know about and that we don't talk about. And again, like everyone has echoed, in order for all of us to be free, if we're really focused on reimagining paradigms of existence, we have to be against every single form of oppression, because they're all interlocking and because they support one another and they uphold one another. So I'll end there. And I don't think I answered your actual questions, but I'm going to try better next time. That's for sure.
No, I mean, honestly, I sometimes just want people to flow, which is, we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to start basically asking our faith family, my brothers at the table, to really just give us a word concerning how you view and understand these interlocking oppressions of nationalism, Christian Zionism, white supremacy. What is the Christian faith on the other side of that? All of you have given a word about deliverance. Mira laid it out perfectly to the point where you answered. I don't have to ask Andrew his question. I was going to say, what's the truth about the white church anyway? That was a leading one, so he could be like, it shouldn't exist. But there is a other side, as Terrence grounded us in knowing that there is singing in the hush harbors as well as struggle, that there is identity in Blackness as well as healing from racial terror, that we have the other side of this struggle, that our, Dr. King said, there's a community that's called Beloved that doesn't have all these things going on. And in fact, it has a people militant who bind together to address the oppressions that would threaten the beauty of the Beloved community. And I sit as the pastor of a church that took that on, but it is a challenge constantly in any country where the founding of this space is itself on the massacre, removal, and erasure of somebody. So how then, and I'll start with Andrew, Aaron, then Terrence, how then, my brothers, do we see faith in Jesus as a coming home? How then do we restore our lost belonging? White folks don't have a real ethnicity. Mira gets to say white Jew. Some people get to trace back to Italy, back to Greece, but for real, white people in the United States ain't real. They ain't real. And it is killing them, right? And it's actually supposed to kill off something within them, but instead it's wreaking havoc on their bodies. And so they are wreaking havoc on the bodies of people that are not white. The bodies of real people are being massacred and murdered because people with a fake identity have some fake power.
That's right.
So what do we do about whiteness, brothers? Aaron, Terrence, what is the other side of that hunger, that thirst for belonging that we've tried to conflate, construct from a white supremacist model, where we just took the master's name off the plantation house and moved right into their bedroom? Please speak as you will, Andrew, Aaron, then Terrence, and then we'll ask Aaron to give us a blessing to depart.
Yeah, I mean, you already said it. Not only is whiteness a myth, but America's a myth. It's all made up. And as we attach our identities to anything that is made up, I mean, it's going to fall apart, right? It's going to fall apart. And as Christians, we're taught that Jesus is the truth, Jesus is the way, Jesus is the life. And yet we've kind of said that's fine, but really we want to be American. Really, we want to be white. We want all those benefits because we got those right now. And those elevate us, right? Those put us in power in the US, and they put us in power everywhere that they are. They put us in power in classrooms. They put us in power in boardrooms. They put us in power out on the streets, because the cops aren't trying to kill me the same way they're trying to, kill a lot of people that I love. So I'm going to attach myself to that, because that keeps me a whole lot safer right here and now. It gives me the money, the status, the power, everything that I want. When Jesus told me to walk away from those things. So that's the first thing, is realizing that not only is whiteness a myth, but America is a myth. And it's a baby myth too. It's not even that old. It's like, we could do a little education and teach the infancy of America which way it needs to go. I think pretty easily, also as an educator. So we can, I feel like we can maybe do something about that. So that's the first thing, is stepping away from that myth and not rooting ourselves in that as white Christians. And then the second thing is what we continue to say, which is nobody's free until everybody's free. That includes white people. Right. So, I mean, it's not as simple as just, doing a DNA test and saying, oh, look, I'm this percent this and this percent that and this percent that. I'm not white. Yay, now I'm free. It's really not that simple. It's constant. And that's our constant struggle that we have to do as white people, in stepping away from that identity and understanding that it's all a myth. It's all a myth. And if we are to root ourselves as Christians in our deity, or any faith, person of faith in their deity, then that means any lie that I've been told about who I am, even if it makes me feel a little good right now, is exactly that. It's a lie. So I have to step away from that and simply exist in the truth.
Yeah, that's a word, Andrew. That's a word. Ooh, when I think about the hope on the other side, the thing that comes to mind for me is that I think that sacred solidarity will save us. I'm reminded that, for a bunch of us Christians, we'll be celebrating Pentecost Sunday, coming up, where we celebrate a movement of the Spirit. But the interesting thing about that passage is it talks about all these people with all these different gifts being able to understand each other. And despite the fact that they were from different locations and different places, they were all, one, deemed faithful, but two, deemed important enough for God's Spirit to rest on them. And I think that the closer that we move, and there has been, I think, especially with recent generations of freedom fighters, the closer that we move to understanding and seeing that God's Spirit not only exists within our bodies and in our locales, but in other places around the world, and other bodies that share not necessarily our location, but our thirst for liberation, that we get closer to that sacred solidarity that can be a hope for us all. And I think that, just from a Christian perspective, the more that I get to know Jesus, I mean, Jesus, not like Jesus, but Jesus, the more that I get to know that, you know, the Palestinian Jew, you know, who fought against empire, who fought against occupation, who lived his life being a voice for others who, you know, were in that same net of oppression, who were in that same net of, you know, despair. The more I get to know the Jesus with his back against the wall, the more inspired I am as a Christian to fight, right? The more that the term Christian has more meaning for me. I love being a Jesus folk, you know, like when I really understand what that means, when I understand the person and the body of who that person was, I find hope in that.
I think I'm gonna say three quick things. Number one, love. Number two, stand. And number three, join. Love, James Baldwin once said, love does not begin and end the way we seem to think it does. Love is a war. Love is a growing up. And then the Apostle Paul talks about those who are part of the body of Christ growing up into God's love. And so for me, love is not some abstract, ethereal goo in the sky. It's a concrete commitment to overcome all that stands in the way of liberation and beloved community. And so we have to root ourselves there, leaning on God's grace to enact that day in and day out, and to repent when we screw it up. Second piece, stand. Out of a place of love, we got to do what St. Ignatius said. This is a quote that just like grounded me maybe 16, 17 years ago, because I thought I was crazy for, you know, what I was feeling called to do. St. Ignatius, way back in the day, said, standing in the lowly places with the easily despised and the readily left out, and with the demonized, so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable, so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. That gives me life. That's where I want to be. And then catch this. I think that's where Jesus insists on standing. So Jesus is standing in Ferguson. Jesus is standing with the people of Palestine. Jesus is always standing with those most vulnerable in the world. And then lastly, join. Y'all, we can't be individual activists out here. It don't work like that. Join an organization. If you saved, it don't matter. Join an organization of heathens. I'm using that word jokingly. Folks that don't believe like you. Join that organization, show up to the meetings, give your money, your time, your talent, your treasures, and get it in. Like, join an organization. We cannot be individuals in this struggle. Join an organization. And I'll just say this, a non-accommodationist organization. So if you join that organization and they talking about something, we got to stand with Israel, fine, move on to the next one. That's all I got.
Thank y'all so much. I really appreciate all the panelists coming out tonight. Your Friday, oh my goodness, you gave us your Friday night. This is amazing. And I'm very thankful. Since April 13th in Palestine, during the holy time of Ramadan, police pressured and pushed and attacked and threatened Palestinian worshipers. All of us as worshipers have some amount of empathy about being pushed out of our worship space, because the worship space is where we come alive. It's where our identities are reframed. It's where all of the things we have been called are pushed away, and we receive again our name. Yeah. And so we're here again right now, in part because this is not a religious struggle, but this struggle involves worshipers. Yeah. And we have to admit that the Israeli Supreme Court decision, yes, had serious impact, but so too did the April 13th threat against worshipers. Why? Because it was also Memorial Day in Israel, and the president wanted to speak in the same place. We believe that folks who claim freedom to worship wherever they want also have to appreciate worshipers' freedom to worship wherever they want. And so I appreciate your willingness to face these contradictions. I appreciate your willingness to say hard and challenging things with the sweetness of your own humility. And I love hearing about your journeys, and I deeply cherish the power that you have to lead in the spaces where you are. I'll turn it over to Aaron to give us a blessing as we depart. We hope that y'all will check out the full list of resources for Why We Stand With Palestine coming out in about a week on faithforjustice.org.
Sure. Let's center ourselves. God of liberation, God of the oppressed, God of those on the margins of our knowing, God in the fight. We thank you for the opportunity to amplify the voices of our friends and fellow freedom fighters. We thank you for the opportunity to look at ourselves in the mirror, to understand our own sins and our own shortcomings as it comes to the oppression of others. We thank you for the opportunity that in the light of freedom, we have an opportunity to change and redirect, to show our support, to move into more whole ways of being, not only for ourselves, but also for the world. We ask that you continue to guide us in this struggle, knowing that it is perpetual, that it is constant, that it is one that is ever before us. Continue to move us closer and closer to a more elegant and right path. In your name we pray. Amen.
Thanks, y'all. Good night.